cool gray light of pre-dawn was the only mercy the gods granted a man of my station. I lay still for a moment on the woven reed mat, feeling the roughness of the dried stalks pressing into my back through the thin linen of my tunic. The air on the roof of our mud brick dwelling was still sweet and chilly, carrying the damp scent of the Euphrates River rather than the dust and dung that would choke the streets by midday. Below me, in the small central courtyard of our house, I heard the soft scratching of a broom. My wife was already awake, sweeping away the spirits of the night, and the sand that the wind never ceased to carry into our lives. I sat up and rubbed the sleep from my eyes. My joints popped, a familiar chorus that sang of yesterday's burdens. Baskets of barley and jars of sesame oil carried from the river barges to the storehouses. I was 30 years old, yet my back felt like that of an elder who had seen 60 floods. I stood and stretched, looking out over the silhouette of Ur. The city was a sleeping giant of clay and shadow. To the west, the massive bulk of the ziggurat of Nana loomed against the fading stars. A mountain built by human hands to bridge the gap between the earth and the heavens. It was beautiful, but it also reminded me of the unpayable debt of labor we all owed to the temples. Descending the wooden ladder into the courtyard, the smell of wood smoke greeted me. Ninsun had a small fire going in the clay oven. She handed me a bowl of water to wash my face. The water was tepid, drawn from the jar we kept in the corner, but it was enough to chase away the last heaviness of sleep. "Sit and eat," she said softly, handing me a flat loaf of barley bread and a bunch of green onions. I tore into the bread. It was dense and gritty, for the millstones always left a little of themselves in the flour, but it was filling. I bit into the onion, the sharp, pungent flavor waking my senses more effectively than the water had. Beside the food, she placed a clay cup of cash, the morning beer. I drank deeply. It was thick, nutritious liquid bread that would keep my strength up when the sun began to hammer down on the harbor. The children were still asleep in the side room, curled together like puppies. I looked at the woven curtain that separated their space from the courtyard. I needed to bring home extra copper today, or perhaps a measure of good wool. The winter winds would come eventually, and their tunics were wearing thin. I finished the beer and wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. I adjusted my skirt, the heavy wool garment that wrapped around my waist and hung to my ankles, the tufts of fabric designed to mimic the fleece of a sheep. I tightened the sash. A porter's sash had to be tight to support the lower back. I grabbed my head pad, a thick ring of felted wool and leather. It was the most important tool I owned, the only thing standing between my skull and the crushing weight of the world. The streets of Ur were narrow and winding. a maze of high mud brick walls that offered shade only in the early hours. As I walked toward the quay, the city began to stir. I passed a potter arranging his wares, the wet clay glistening as he set bowls out to dry. A priest with a shaven head and a linen robe walked briskly past me, his eyes fixed on the horizon, likely late for the morning rites. We did not speak. Men like him lived in a world of incense and chants. I lived in a world of sweat and leverage. The sound of the harbor reached me before the sight of it. It was a low hum that grew into a roar, the shouting of boat captains, the bleating of goats, the creaking of wood against wood. I turned the final corner, and the Euphrates stretched out before me, wide and sluggish, brown with the silt of the northern mountains. The quay was chaos. Ships from Dilmun were docked, their black, bitumen-coated hulls bobbing gently in the current. They brought copper, diorite, and precious stones, goods that made rich and men like me tired. I scanned the crowd for Lunana, the overseer of the wharf laborers. I found him standing atop a crate, holding a clay tablet and a stylus barking orders at a group of men who were struggling with a massive cedar log. "You there?" Lunana shouted, pointing his stylus at me as I approached. "You are late, Ernanch. The sun has already kissed the water." "The sun is barely up," I muttered to myself, but to him I merely bowed my head. "I am here now, overseer. What is the burden?" He gestured toward a high-prowed boat that smelled of salt and dried fish, jars of oil from the upper river. "They go to the temple of Ningal. Do not break them, or you will work for free until the next king is crowned." I joined the line of men waiting by the gangplank. The air here was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fish guts, and the sweet, cloying scent of sesame oil leaking from a cracked vessel somewhere nearby. I greeted a few of the other porters with a nod. We were a brotherhood of the back, bound by the shared understanding of weight. When it was my turn, 2 sailors on the deck of the ship hoisted a large clay amphora. It was sealed with a clay stopper and stood as tall as a child. I stepped forward, bending my knees, and positioned my shoulder under the curve of the jar. On 3, the sailor grunted. 1, 2, 3. The weight settled onto me, heavy and unforgiving. I gritted my teeth, feeling my spine compress. I adjusted my stance, finding the center of gravity, and signaled that I had it. I turned slowly, balancing the amphora with one hand, while the other steadied me against the ship's railing. The gangplank was narrow and bounced with every step. A fall here would mean a plunge into the brown water between the hull and the dock. A dangerous place where a man could easily be crushed. I made it to the solid ground of the quay and began the trek to the staging area where the temple carts waited. The sun was rising faster now, burning through the morning mist. I could feel the heat beginning to radiate from the clay bricks of the warehouse walls. My bare feet gripped the dust, each step a calculation of energy and balance. At the cart, a scribe stood with a tablet of wet clay in his hand. He looked at me with bored eyes. "Name?" he asked. "Ernanch," I wheezed, not dropping the load yet. He pressed the stylus into the clay, making the wedge-shaped marks that held my name. Contents: sesame oil. He made another mark, set it down. I lowered the jar, muscles trembling as the tension released. The relief was instant, a wash of pleasure that was almost better than the beer. I rolled my shoulders and took a deep breath, but there was no time to rest. The boat was full, and the line of porters was moving. Back and forth we went. The sun climbed higher, turning the sky from a soft blue to a blinding white. The shadows shortened and vanished. Sweat ran down my forehead, stinging my eyes. The dust of the quay stuck to my skin, turning me into a statue of mud. By mid-morning, the rhythm of the work had taken over. I stopped thinking about the debt or the worn tunics of my children. I became a machine of flesh and bone. Lift, carry, set down. Lift, carry, set down. My world narrowed to the few feet of ground in front of me and the rhythmic sway of the man ahead. There was a commotion near the bow of the ship. One of the younger porters, a boy who had only joined us a moon ago, had stumbled. A crate of dried dates had spilled, scattering the dark, sticky fruit across the dusty planks. The overseer, Lunana, was there in an instant, his voice rising above the din of the market. "Clumsy ox, look at this waste." I paused for a moment, wiping my face with the edge of my sash. The boy was on his knees, frantically trying to scoop the dates back into the broken crate. He looked terrified. In this city, waste was a theft from the gods. I felt a pang of sympathy. I had dropped a jar of grain once, years ago. The shame burned hotter than the sun. I stepped out of line and knelt beside him. "Leave the dirtied ones," I whispered. "Just gather the clean fruit." Quickly. The boy looked at me, eyes wide, and nodded. We worked fast, throwing the salvageable dates back into the wood frame. By the time Lunana finished his tirade, the mess was mostly cleared. The overseer glared at me, but said nothing. He knew I was a good worker, and good workers were harder to find than shouting overseers. "Get back to the line, Ernanch," he grunted. I returned to the ship. My stomach gave a low rumble. The morning beer and bread were long gone, burned away by the labor. I looked toward the position of the sun. It was nearly overhead. Soon, the temple gongs would sound for the midday meal. The work shifted as the oil was finished. Now came bales of wool, lighter but bulkier, scratching against the neck and face. The smell of the lanolin was strong, hoisted a bale onto my back, the rough fibers digging into my skin. As I walked toward the scribe, I looked up at the ziggurat again. The temple of Nana shone brilliantly in the high sun, its baked bricks glistening. The priests were up there, likely offering cool water and roasted meat to the moon god, asking for his blessing on the city. I did not envy them their cool water. Well, perhaps a little, but I knew that while they fed the gods, it was men like me who fed the city. Every grain of barley, every drop of oil, every thread of wool passed through our hands. We were the strong legs upon which stood. The scribe tallied my load. "That is the last of the wool for this cart," he said, smoothing the clay of his tablet. "Take a break, porter. The sun is too angry." I nodded, grateful. I walked to the shade of a warehouse wall, where a large communal water jar stood. I used a gourd dipper to pour the water over my head, gasping as the coolness shocked my heated skin. I drank a little, swishing it in my mouth to clear the dust. Sitting in the sliver of shade, I watched the harbor. The chaos had not slowed, but my part in it had paused. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the river lapping against the stone quay. The morning was gone, dissolved into sweat and effort. The afternoon waited, heavy and hot, promising more burdens to lift. But for now, in the shadow of the clay wall, I was a free man, breathing the air of the greatest city in the world. I rested my head back against the warm brick and prepared myself for the work to come. The sun had climbed to the very apex of the sky, transforming the great city of into a kiln of baked mud and shimmering heat. I wiped the stinging sweat from my eyes with the back of a wrist that was coated in the gray dust of the harbor. At midday, the light did not fall gently. It struck the earth with a physical force, turning the waters of the Euphrates into a blinding sheet of polished bronze. My world had narrowed to the patch of ground directly in front of my feet, and the rhythm of my own labored breathing. The task at hand was copper. A heavy-bottomed boat had arrived from the distant lands of Magan, its reed-bundled hull sitting low in the water, burdened with ingots of the raw metal. I stood in a line of other men, all of us silent, all of us staring at the man ahead, waiting for our turn to receive the weight. When the foreman signaled, I stepped forward onto the wooden gangplank, the timber groaning under the collective movement of the laborers. 2 crewmen from the boat, their skin darkened by weeks at sea, heaved a rough slab of copper onto the leather pad resting on my shoulders. The breath left my lungs in a sharp hiss. The weight was immense, a solid, unforgiving density that sought to drive my feet deep into the riverbank mud. I adjusted the head strap, feeling the coarse fibers bite into my forehead, and began the trudge up the slope toward the merchant's warehouse. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. My leg muscles burned, trembling slightly under the strain. But to stop was to invite the wrath of the overseer, who stood in the shade of a palm, awning with a rod of stripped cedar in his hand. He did not need to shout. His presence was enough to keep the line moving. As I ascended the embankment, the sounds of the harbor assaulted my ears, a chaotic symphony of commerce that never ceased, even in the midday swelter. I heard the bleating of goats being heralded onto a barge bound for Uruk, the sharp cracking of timber as shipwrights repaired a hull, and the guttural languages of traders from the mountains to the east. The air smelled of drying fish by bitumen and the sour tang of wet wool, all baking together in the relentless heat. I reached the receiving yard of the merchant, a man named Enasir, who was known throughout the city for his dealings in copper. He stood by a pile of crates, arguing with a customer about the quality of the previous shipment. I ignored their voices, focusing only on the scribe who sat cross-legged on a reed mat near the entrance. The scribe was young, his tunic clean and white, a stark contrast to my own rag, which was stiff with sweat and grime. He held a mound of damp clay in one hand and a stylus in the other. As I approached the designated pile, I bent my knees and allowed the heavy ingot to slide from my back. It landed with a dull thud against the others. The relief was instantaneous, a sudden buoyancy that made me feel as though I might float away. I straightened my spine, hearing the satisfying pop of vertebrae realigning. The scribe glanced at me, or rather, he glanced at the space I occupied, his eyes looking through me as if I were merely a mechanism of transport. He pressed the stylus into the clay, making a wedge-shaped mark to tally the delivery. I turned back toward the river, but the overseer raised a hand, signaling a halt. It was high noon. The sun was too fierce, even for the driving ambition of the merchants. Work would pause for the time it took to eat and rest the animals. A collective sigh seemed to ripple through the harbor as hundreds of men slumped where they stood or sought the slivers of shade cast by the high mud brick walls of the warehouses. I found a spot beneath the overhang of a granary where the shadow was deep and cool. I sank to the ground, the dust puffing up around me, and leaned my back against the rough bricks. My friend Ernanch dropped down beside me. He was a large man, stronger than most, but even he looked drained, his chest heaving as he wiped his face with a cloth. We did not speak immediately. Words required energy we could not spare. I reached into the pouch at my waist and retrieved my midday meal. It was simple fare, a round of unleavened barley bread, an onion, and a few dried dates. I bit into the onion first, the sharp, pungent flavor cutting through the taste of dust in my mouth. It made my eyes water, but it woke my senses. The bread was hard, baked days ago, but I softened it with a swig of beer from the clay jar Ernanch passed to me. The beer was thick, almost like a gruel, and rich with the sediment of the grain. It filled the belly and dulled the ache in my shoulders. In Sumer, beer was not a luxury, it was life. The water from the river could bring sickness, but the beer was safe, given to us by the goddess Ninkasi. The copper is heavy today, Ernanch murmured, tearing a piece of bread with his teeth. Heavier than the timber from last week. It is the heat, I replied, my voice raspy. The sun presses down as hard as the load. We ate in silence for a time, watching the activity on the river slow to a crawl. A skiff glided by, poling upstream against the current, laden with baskets of reed mats. Across the water, the palm groves shimmered in the haze, green islands in a sea of brown earth. Far beyond the city walls, I knew the farmers were resting in their huts, waiting for the fury of the sun to pass before they returned to the irrigation ditches. My gaze drifted toward the center of the city, where the great ziggurat of the moon god Nana rose like a man-made mountain. Its tiers were crisp and sharp against the blue sky, the baked bricks glowing with a reddish hue. At the very top, the temple stood silent and imposing. I wondered what the priests were doing in the cool, shadowed chambers of the sanctuary. They would be dining on roasted mutton and fresh fish, pouring clear wine into alabaster cups. Their hands were soft, stained only by ink or the oil of anointing, not by the copper and mud that stained mine. I need to earn 3 shekels of silver this month, Ernanch said quietly, breaking my reverie. My daughter is to be married soon. I must provide a gift. I nodded, understanding the burden. We were free men, not bondsmen, yet we were chained to the daily struggle for grain and silver. The merchant Nasir is stingy, I warned. He pays in copper shavings and bad grain if you are not careful. Make sure the scribe marks your tally correctly. I watch him, Ernanch said, though we both knew that if a scribe decided to cheat a porter, there was little recourse. The word of a man who could write was worth 10 times the word of a man who could only carry. The brief respite ended too soon. The overseer clapped his hands, the sound sharp and echoing against the warehouse walls. Groans rose from the gathered men as we pushed ourselves up from the dust. My muscles had stiffened during the break, and the first few movements were stiff and painful. I stretched my arms, feeling the pull in my lower back. The sun had moved only slightly, its intensity undiminished. The afternoon task changed. The copper was unloaded, and now we were to transport jars of sesame oil from the warehouse to the market district within the city walls. This was a different kind of challenge. The jars were smooth and curved, difficult to grip, and sealed with clay stoppers. To drop one was to lose a month's wages. We wrapped our arms around the vessels, lifting them with grunts of exertion, and formed a line heading away from the river. Entering the city streets was like stepping into a maze. The avenues near the harbor were wide enough for carts, but as we moved deeper into the residential quarters, the paths narrowed. The walls of the houses rose high on either side, blocking out the sun but trapping the heat. The air here was still and heavy, smelling of open drains and cooking fires. We navigated the winding alleys, shouting warnings to pedestrians to clear the way. Children darted between our legs, chasing hoops made of willow, while stray dogs snapped at the flies buzzing around the refuse piles. I walked with careful, measured steps. The jar I carried was slick, with a thin film of oil that had seeped through the porous clay, making it treacherous. I focused on the ground, watching for uneven bricks or puddles of waste that could send me sprawling. My sandals were worn thin, and I could feel every stone through the leather soles. We passed a small neighborhood shrine, a niche in the wall holding a clay figurine of a protective deity. A woman stood before it, pouring a libation of water. She did not look at us. To the people of the city, we were part of the infrastructure, as essential and unnoticed as the mud bricks or the canal water. The market square was a riot of color and noise. Vendors sat under colorful awnings, displaying wares from every corner of the civilized world. There was lapis lazuli from the Far East, blue as the deep sky, carnelian beads, finely woven wool garments dyed in vibrant reds and purples, and baskets of freshwater fish packed in salt. The noise was deafening, haggling customers, shouting hawkers, the braying of donkeys. We deposited the oil jars at the shop of a perfumer, a man with a beard oiled and curled in the latest fashion. He inspected each jar with a critical eye, tapping the clay to check for cracks. I stood waiting, my arms trembling from the sustained tension of holding the vessel. Sweat dripped from my nose onto the dusty floor. "This one is chipped," the perfumer accused, pointing to a jar carried by a younger porter near the back of the line. "It was given to me that way, master," the boy stammered, fear widening his eyes. The perfumer waved a hand dismissively. "Tell your overseer I will deduct a portion of the payment. Be gone." We left the shop, empty-handed but not unburdened. The walk back to the harbor was easier, but the fatigue was cumulative. The day was only half over. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, but the heat would linger in the stones of the city long into the night. As I walked, I thought of the river. When the work was done, I would wash the dust from my skin in the cool waters of the Euphrates. I would sit on the bank and watch the stars emerge one by one over the ziggurat. But for now, the river was just another path to tread, and the copper and oil were the masters I served. I quickened my pace, falling back into rhythm with Ernanch. There was more cargo to move, more tallies to earn, and the day was not yet done. the sun of the afternoon hung directly overhead, a blazing eye of the god Udu staring down upon the dusty streets of Ur. It felt as though the heat had weight, pressing down upon my shoulders just as heavily as the cedar beam I balanced there. Sweat ran in rivulets through the dust on my face, stinging my eyes, but I did not dare raise a hand to wipe it away. To lose my grip on this timber would be a disaster I could not afford. This wood had traveled all the way from the distant mountains of the north, floated down the great Euphrates on rafts, and it was worth more than a man like me could earn in 5 years of labor. Move, I told myself. Just keep moving. My sandals slapped against the packed earth of the narrow alleyway. The air was thick with the smells of the city. I breathed in the scent of roasting onions from a nearby courtyard, the sharp tang of donkey dung, and the underlying, constant odor of river mud baking in the sun. Around me, the city hummed with the noise of commerce. Even in the heat, Ur did not sleep. I could hear the rhythmic pounding of a coppersmith hammering a bowl, the bleating of goats being herded toward the temple, and the high-pitched shouting of a woman selling woven mats. I navigated the crowd with the instinct of a mule. I twisted my torso to avoid clipping a scribe walking with his nose buried in a tablet, and I sidestepped a puddle of slop thrown from a doorway without breaking my stride. The destination was the warehouse of Master Enkiziana, a merchant who dealt in luxury goods for the priesthood. When I finally reached the wide doors of the storehouse, my muscles were trembling. The other porters were already there, resting in the sliver of shade provided by the high mud brick wall. I lowered the cedar beam slowly, groaning as the weight left my spine. A foreman, a man with a thick neck and a skirt of rough wool, pointed a thick finger at where he wanted the wood stacked. "Careful with that," he barked. "If you chip it, the cost comes out of your rations." I nodded, lacking the breath to speak, and set the timber down gently atop a pile of others. My shoulders throbbed where the rough bark had bitten into my skin. I straightened up and stretched my back, hearing the joints pop. "Get a drink, then get back to the key," the foreman grunted, turning his attention to a scribe who was tallying the delivery on a wet clay tablet. I joined the other men by the water jar. The water was warm and tasted of the clay pot, but it was wet. I drank deeply, letting it wash the grit from my throat. One of the men, a fellow named Ernanch, whom I had known since we were children playing in the irrigation ditches, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "The river is low today," Ernanch murmured, leaning his head back against the wall. "The boats are having trouble docking close. We have to walk further with the loads." I grunted in agreement. Low water meant more walking, more carrying, and more exhaustion. Yet the grain ration at the end of the day remained the same. It was the way of things. We were the hands and feet of the city, The priests were the head, and the king was the crown, but without us, nothing moved. After a few moments of respite, the foreman clapped his hands, a sharp sound that cut through our brief rest. "Back to it," he shouted. "The boat from Dilmun is waiting to be unloaded." The mention of Dilmun stirred a small ripple of interest in my chest. Ships from Dilmun brought copper, strange stones, and sometimes sweet dates that were larger and stickier than the ones we grew here. Unloading a Dilmun boat was heavy work, as copper ingots were dense and unforgiving. But sometimes a cracked jar meant a taste of something sweet. I adjusted my loincloth and retied the leather strap I used to secure loads to my back. We marched back out into the glare of the sun, the heat radiating off the clay walls of the houses was intense, creating shimmering waves in the air. As we approached the harbor, the noise intensified. The quay was a chaotic swirl of humanity. Sailors shouting in foreign tongues, donkeys braying in protest under heavy sacks of barley, and the constant splash of poles hitting the water filled the air. The river itself was a slow brown serpent, glittering blindingly under the sun. I saw the ship immediately. It was a high, proud vessel, its reeds coated thick with bitumen that shone black in the light. The crew looked weary, their skin darkened by weeks under the open sky. The task for the next 2 hours was moving copper. The ingots were shaped like ox hides, heavy and awkward to hold. I hoisted one onto my shoulder, grunting as the metal dug into my flesh. It was hot to the touch, having sat on the deck in the sun. Step by step, I carried the copper from the boat to the weighing station. There, a temple official sat under a woven awning, meticulously weighing each ingot against stone weights shaped like sleeping ducks. He did not look at me. He only looked at the scale, his stylus dancing over the clay tablet in his hand, recording the transaction for the archives of the moon god, Nana. I am not a man of letters. The wedge-shaped marks the scribes make are a mystery to me, silent voices caught in the mud. But I know that those marks control my life. They decide how much grain I take home to my wife, how much oil we have for the lamp, and whether my children will have new sandals for the festival. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the copper was unloaded. My arms felt like they were made of lead. My legs burned with every step. But the day was not done. The harbor master called out for men to move baskets of fish from the reed boats of the marsh dwellers. The smell hit me before I saw them, a pungent, earthy aroma of river life. The fish were piled high in woven baskets, their silver scales dulling as they dried. I hoisted a basket onto my back, the straps digging into my forehead. This load was lighter than the copper, but it was wet and slimy. Fish water trickled down my neck, warm and smelling of the deep river. I ignored it, A porter who complains is a porter who is replaced. I carried the fish to the salting yards, a section of the market where the air was so thick with salt it tasted sharp on the tongue. Women sat in rows, gutting the fish with obsidian blades, their hands moving with practiced speed. I dumped my basket where a woman pointed, and she gave me a brief nod. "Move along," she said, her voice raspy. "We have much to do before dark." I walked back toward the docks, my pace slowing. The shadows were beginning to stretch, painting long dark stripes across the dusty ground. The frantic energy of the midday market was softening into the steady, enduring rhythm of the late afternoon. I found a moment to stop by a vendor selling beer. I had a small ring of silver in my pouch, earned from a private job 2 days prior, but I did not want to spend it. Instead, I bartered a small service, helping the woman move her heavy jar of brewing mash to a shaded corner in exchange for a bowl. The beer was thick, unfiltered, and nourishing. I drank it through a reed straw to filter out the husks floating on top. It was sour and refreshing, filling my empty stomach with warmth. It gave me the strength to face the final stretch of the day. As I stood there, wiping the foam from my lip, I watched a procession leaving the temple district. Priests in linen robes, their heads shaved clean, walked with solemn purpose. They carried incense burners that trailed fragrant smoke, masking the stench of the city for a fleeting moment. We, the common people, stepped aside and bowed our heads. They were the servants of the gods, the ones who kept the river flowing and the harvest plentiful. I watched them pass, wondering what it would be like to live inside the cool, thick walls of the ziggurat, to spend one's days chanting and pouring libations, rather than sweating and straining under heavy loads. But such thoughts were idle. My place was here, in the dust and the noise. The final task of the afternoon was personal. I needed to collect my ration. I made my way to the household of the merchant I had served earlier. The scribe was there, the clay tablet now dry in the sun. He looked at me, squinting against the glare. "You are the one who moved the cedar." "I am," I replied, keeping my head lowered respectfully. He nodded and checked his marks. 3 measures of barley. He handed me a token, a small piece of clay with a seal impression. I took it, clutching it tightly in my hand. This was the life of my family. I walked to the granary door, where a steward measured out the grain into the sack I carried at my waist. The sound of the barley pouring was the sweetest music I had heard all day. I tied the sack tight. The weight of it at my hip was comforting. It was not a heavy load, not compared to the timber or the copper, but it was the most important one. The sun was now dipping low, turning the sky into a bruise of purple and orange. The heat was finally breaking, replaced by a gentle breeze coming off the river. The city was changing its character. The shouting of the market was fading, replaced by the sounds of families gathering, fires being lit for the evening meal, and the distant barking of dogs. I began the walk home. My house was in the lower district, a small structure of mud brick shared with my brother's family. My body ached, my back, my shoulders, my legs, but it was a good ache. It was the feeling of a day survived, of duties fulfilled. As I walked, I passed a group of children playing with a ball made of rags. They shouted and ran, kicking up dust. I smiled, thinking of my own son. Perhaps, if the gods were kind and the harvest good, he might not have to carry the heavy loads. Perhaps he could learn to make the marks on the clay. I turned the corner, the familiar sight of my doorway coming into view. The smell of baking bread wafted out to meet me. The afternoon was over. The work was done. I adjusted the sack of grain one last time, standing a little straighter despite the fatigue. I was a porter of strong and enduring, and I was coming home. The long shadow of the great ziggurat stretched across the dusty pavement of the market district, reaching out like a dark hand to claim the city for the night. My back screamed in protest as I adjusted the heavy woven strap against my forehead, the rough fibers biting into the callus that had formed there over 20 years of labor. This was the final load of the day, a basket of dried dates from the Dilmun trade boats that smelled of honey and river mud. The heat of the day was finally beginning to lift, rising from the baked clay bricks of the narrow streets and dissipating into the violet sky. But the sweat still plastered my linen tunic to my skin. I placed one foot in front of the other, feeling the grit of sand between my toes. The rhythmic thud of my own footsteps was lost in the cacophony of the closing market. Around me, the city of was transitioning. Merchants were rolling up their reed mats, shouting final prices to the few stragglers who hoped for a bargain in the twilight. Donkeys brayed in protest as they were led away from the troughs, and the sharp scent of roasting goat meat began to drift from the cook fires, lighting up in the courtyards behind the high walls. Reaching the warehouse of the merchant Enasir, I signaled to the overseer standing by the entrance. He held a wet clay tablet in the crook of his arm, his stylus poised like a waiting insect. He barely looked at me, merely gesturing with a flick of his wrist toward the far corner of the storage room where other baskets were piled high. I navigated the dim interior, the air thick with the smell of copper and wool, and bent my knees to lower the heavy burden. The relief was instantaneous as the weight left my spine. I stood straight, rolling my shoulders back to work out the stiffness, and heard the familiar crack of my joints. I returned to the entrance, waiting for the scribe to mark my tally. He pressed the stylus into the soft clay, making a wedge shape that signified my completion of the task. He reached into a small jar and handed me a rough clay token, the promise of my barley ration. It was a small thing, hard and cool in my palm, but it represented the difference between hunger and contentment for my family this evening. I nodded to him, a silent gesture of respect for his station, though my thoughts were already drifting toward the river. Leaving the warehouse district, I walked toward the canal. The Euphrates was the lifeblood of our land, and in the evening light, the water turned the color of hammered bronze. I knelt by the bank, cupping the water in my hands to wash the dust from my face and neck. The coolness was a blessing from Enki himself. Further down the bank, fishermen were hauling in their nets, their silhouettes dark against the shimmering water. I watched them for a moment, envying the way the river carried their boats, while I was bound to carry the earth on my back. The walk home took me through the twisting residential streets. The houses here were huddled close together, presenting blank mud brick faces to the alleyways to keep out the heat and the prying eyes of neighbors. I navigated the maze by memory, my feet knowing every uneven stone and rut. As the light faded, the oil lamps began to flicker in the doorways, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. We were taught to be wary of the spirits that roamed in the darkness, the ones who slipped through cracks in the walls. So I muttered a quiet prayer to Nana, the moon god, asking for his silver light to guide my path. When I pushed aside the woven reed mat that served as our door, the smell of home washed over me. It was a scent of wood smoke, baking bread, and the pungent aroma of onions. My wife was kneeling by the hearth in the center of our small open courtyard, fanning the embers under a clay pot. She looked up as I entered, her face illuminated by the orange glow of the fire. The lines around her eyes softened when she saw me, and she set down the palm leaf fan. I sat heavily on the low bench built against the wall, extending my legs. My youngest son, who had barely seen 5 harvests, ran to me, clutching a small wooden toy carved to look like a lion. I ruffled his hair, feeling the coarse texture, and listened as he babbled about a stray dog he had seen near the temple precinct. His energy was boundless, a stark contrast to the heavy weariness that settled into my bones. My wife brought me a bowl of stew. It was thick with barley, onions, and chickpeas, flavored with a bit of fish sauce. Alongside it, she placed a flat loaf of bread, still warm from the oven wall. I broke the bread, using it to scoop up the stew, and the taste was rich and grounding. We did not have meat often, perhaps only on feast days, but the grain was good and filling. She poured beer from a large jar into a communal bowl, and I drank through the reed straw, the liquid thick and sour-sweet. It dulled the ache in my shoulders and brought a pleasant warmth to my chest. We ate in the courtyard as the square of sky above us turned from deep blue to black. the stars began to emerge, piercing the veil of the night. My wife spoke of her day, of the neighbors and the weaving she had done. I listened, nodding, letting her voice anchor me to the world of the living, away from the endless lifting and carrying. She told me that the price of wool was rising, and that the canal near the weavers' district needed dredging. These were the small currents of our lives, the things that mattered more to us than the decrees of kings or the movements of armies. After the meal, I climbed the wooden ladder to the flat roof of our house. This was my favorite time, the quiet hour before sleep took me. The roof was still warm from the sun, but a light breeze was blowing from the north, carrying the scent of the marshes. I laid out my sleeping mat, a simple weave of rushes, and sat looking out over the city. From this height, was a landscape of shadows and light. I could see the glow of fires from 1,000 courtyards, like a reflection of the starry sky above. In the distance, the ziggurat of Namu rose like a mountain made by human hands, its upper terraces illuminated by torches. It was a reminder of the order of things. The gods lived in the high places, and we lived below, serving them with our sweat. I did not resent this. It was simply the way the world was made, written on the tablets of destiny long before I was born. I rubbed the back of my neck, feeling the knot of muscle there. Tomorrow the sun would rise, and the market would open again. There would be jars of oil from the north, timber from the cedar forests, and copper from the mountains. There would be shouting and bargaining, the heat and the dust. I would carry it all, load by load, for the sake of the grain and the oil, for the roof over my head and the family sleeping below. I lay back on the mat, staring up at the constellations. I traced the shape of the wain and the great bull of heaven. They were silent watchers, indifferent to the struggles of a porter, yet their constancy was comforting. The noise of the city had dulled to a low hum. The barking of dogs and the distant chant of priests in the temple complex, the only sounds breaking the stillness. Sleep began to pull at the edges of my consciousness. My body, exhausted and heavy, sank into the woven reeds. The ache in my feet subsided into a dull throb. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness wrap around me like a soft cloak. My last thought was not of the heavy baskets or the shouting overseers, but of the cool water of the river and the taste of the warm bread. The day was done. The night belonged to me. I drifted away, carried by the invisible current of sleep, ready to rest before the sun demanded my strength once more. I shifted slightly, finding a more comfortable position on the mat. The night air was cooling rapidly, a welcome change from the furnace of the afternoon. I pulled a rough wool blanket over my legs. Nearby, on a neighboring roof, I could hear the murmur of voices, a man and a woman speaking in low tones. It was a reminder that I was but one of thousands, all of us resting under the same vast sky, all of us gathering our strength for the dawn. The fear of the gala demons that haunted the darkness felt distant here on the roof, closer to the stars. I felt a sense of safety in the routine, in the knowledge that I had done my duty. I had earned my rest. The barley was in the jar. The door was barred. The gods were in their temples. All was as it should be in the land of Sumer. And so, with the steady rhythm of my own breathing filling my ears, I finally let go of the day.